way. But in fact, honest professors, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, are now saying that the idea of rights goes all the way back to the 12th century and Catholic canon lawyers who gave the idea its birth. And the idea of a right simply means that I have a certain immunity to invasion by you. You can't just arbitrarily kill me or deprive me of my property, things of this nature. That's all a right is, that it would be wrong for you to interfere with me in these areas. And where does this liberating idea come from? From the heart of the Church. Or again, economic science. Did Adam Smith just think of economics in the 18th century? It all just came out of his head. He had this gigantic head, and all of economics just poured out of it. No. In fact, for the past 50 years, what have historians been saying? They've been saying that it was the Catholic scholastics, professors who taught in particularly Spanish universities, and specifically the University of Salamanca, that gave birth to modern economics. They were the founders of economics, not secularists of the Enlightenment. This is now being discovered. On the wall of my office, I have a framed picture of the University of Salamanca. Now, most people would come in and say, "What's the matter with you, man? Why would you, of all universities, pick this one?" It's because I know that this is where economics was given birth. And if you're a geek like me, you're very interested in and you love economics. But then finally, for right now, before our break, what about our commitment to reason? Don't we always pride ourselves in Western civilization on our commitment to the use of reason? That we use human reason to resolve disputes and to settle debates? Well, of course. But where does that come from? Where does that come from? That also comes from the Catholic Church. Why? Because the university system that the Catholic Church fostered encouraged debate, rigorous debate. And human reason was held up as the great arbiter to decide all these matters that are up for debate. Again, isn't that the opposite of what you're told? What we're told is that the Catholic Church is an enemy of reason. To the contrary, there has been no greater champion of reason. But it's not just reason. It's more specific applications of reason. For example, the sciences in particular. The sciences, more than we realize, owe themselves to the Catholic Church. Now, why is that? It's the opposite of what we're told, but believe it or not, historians of the past 50 years have begun to say the Catholic Church is more and more responsible for the sciences. Come on back and we'll talk about this after the break. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Before the break, we were talking about all these areas in which the Catholic contribution to our civilization has been indispensable, but in which it's largely neglected. How many of the facts that we've uncovered even up to now are covered in schools on a regular basis? Do I even have to ask that question? But I teased you a little bit with the idea of the Catholic Church as having helped to give birth to science in Western civilization just before our break here. What did I mean by that? Well, I'm going to tease you a little bit again, because by next time we're going to get into the sciences in real depth, the next 3 episodes, in fact, because here I think we have the aspect of Catholic history that is most often mangled and distorted, and most often used, I think, as a bludgeon with which to beat the Church over the head. And I want to show that this is largely without merit. What I at least want to tell you for now is that it really is true that over the past 50 years, scientists who write the history of science have begun rethinking the old arguments against the Church and said, you know what, on second thought, the Church actually did very important things. There's a reason that science took root and then was sustained for so long in Western civilization, whereas it wasn't in others. And this, it turns out, is not in spite of the Catholic Church, but in some ways because of it. Now, 100 years ago, it's true, you would have read a book by Andrew Dixon White called, that refers to the alleged warfare between religion and science in Western civilization. Today, White's book is considered almost laughable among professors. It's so out of date and so ludicrous. Today, you have professors like Edward Grant writing Cambridge University Press books. You've got Thomas Goldstein, A.C. Crombie, David Lindbergh, and many besides. And what they all agree on is that you can't just say the Church was an opponent of the sciences. To the contrary, there were aspects of Catholic thinking that were indispensable for the development of science. And we're going to get into specifically what were those. But right now, I want you to know that this old myth is being overturned by professors. Unfortunately, the findings of these professors have not managed to trickle down to the general public yet. This is what we're going to try to do on our series. Let me give you, by the way, an example of a typical story that people have been taught to believe about the Catholic Church, and then consider why it is they so readily believed it when there isn't even a stitch of evidence for it. And here's an example that I think even many people in the viewing audience might have believed, and I myself believed. I have no reason to think otherwise. And that's the idea that Christopher Columbus, when he engaged in his famous voyages, was actually seeking in part to prove that the Earth was not flat, but rather spherical. Now, we've all heard the usual story that Columbus was warned. No, Columbus, no, don't go sailing that far. You're going to fall off the edge of the Earth. Don't you know that? The Earth is a big flat disk, and you're going to fall off the edge and get eaten by dragons, or giant radioactive spiders are going to eat you, something like that. He was warned about all this. Don't do it. Well, he did it anyway, and this goes to show how brave and wonderful he was. Now, I don't dispute that Columbus was indeed a brave and skilled navigator. But Columbus himself, were he here today, would tell you that he was not seeking to prove the Earth was spherical. Why? Because everybody already knew it. Everybody already knew the Earth was a sphere. In effect, no educated person in Europe believed the Earth was flat. That is a myth. That's an almost absurd myth. In fact, just try to go back and find anybody in the history of Christendom who believed in a flat Earth. Just look for them. If everybody believed it, that shouldn't be so hard. And yet you can't find any examples. Well, I correct myself. You can find two examples of people you've never heard of. Lactantius, for example, from the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. He had no influence on anybody, and in any event, he was speaking more allegorically than anything else. The other person who seems to have believed it was a 6th century figure named Cosmas Indicopleustes. You ever heard of him? Neither have I. And neither had anybody in Western Europe. Cosmas wrote in Greek. By the time you get to that period of time, hardly anybody in the West speaks Greek. Pope St. Gregory the Great, for instance, who was Pope from 590 to 604, already he doesn't even speak a word of Greek. So hardly anybody could have read Cosmas. He wasn't translated into Latin until 1706. So anybody who may have taught a flat Earth had an audience of about 1 or 2 people, had no influence on anybody. The fact is, everybody understood the Earth was a sphere. The reason people were reluctant to sponsor Columbus wasn't that they were afraid he was going to fall off the edge. The reason they were afraid to do it was that they thought he had very much underestimated the size of that sphere. Columbus was saying, oh, don't worry about it. It's not a very big Earth. I'll just sail right around. I'll be right back. It'll be fine. But they were saying to him, no, the Earth is several times larger than you think it is, and you're just going to starve to death. You're going to sail, and you're going to sail, and you're going to sail, and you're not going to be any land. Well, luckily for Columbus, a couple of continents managed to spring up, quite contrary to his expectation, and thankfully for him and for his crew. But that was why they didn't want him to go. It wasn't because they thought he was going to fall off the edge. Now, I realize that is so much the opposite of what you've been told. You almost think that I must be making this up, right? Sure, people believe in a flat Earth, but I promise you they didn't. And there's actually a whole book that was written to answer the obvious follow-up question. If nobody believed in a flat Earth, how did this myth ever get started? And the answer comes in a small book by a guy named Jeffrey Burton Russell. He wrote a book called Inventing the Flat Earth. And what he found was that it was a very, very tiny group of intellectuals in the 19th century who gave birth to this myth. And they did it because it made the Catholic Church look ridiculous.